Mr. Chairman, it's a great pleasure to be back. I want to make 5 or 6 quick analytical points and suggest a 3-part action program for the United States to deal with the problem. First, the Chinese renminbi is undervalued by about 25% on a trade-weighted average basis and about 40% against the dollar. That's on the basis of at least a dozen studies done in my own institute and elsewhere. It's well established. If anything, it's a conservative number. You can put that in your head, I think, and use it. 2, the Chinese authorities buy about $1 billion of dollars every day in the exchange markets. They buy dollars, they sell their local currency. That keeps the price of that local currency cheap, keeps it undervalued in the exchange markets to maintain an artificially strong competitive position. It's very important to keep in mind that several of their neighboring Asian countries, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, peg themselves de facto to the RMB, and so it's not just China that's competitively undervalued, it's a lot of Asia, and you add those others in and it almost doubles the ante in terms of global trade effects and impact on the United States. Third, this competitive undervaluation of the Chinese currency and its neighbors is a blatant form of protectionism. It subsidizes all Chinese exports by the amount of the undervaluation, 25 to 40%. It equates to a tariff of 25 to 40% on all of those Asian imports, sharply discouraging purchase from other countries. It would thus be incorrect, and I echo you, Mr. Chairman, it would be incorrect to characterize as protectionist a policy response to the Chinese actions by the U.S. or other countries. Such actions, if skillfully chosen and properly carried out, should in fact be viewed as anti-protectionist. Point 4, China's global current account surplus soared to almost $400 billion, exceeded 11% of its GDP 2 years ago, an unprecedented imbalance for the world's largest exporting country and second largest economy. Its surplus, of course, dropped sharply during the recession, but the IMF has just forecast that the number is going up again, and by 2014 will exceed $700 billion and actually be bigger than the U.S. global current account deficit. So it's not a problem that's about to go away. If anything, it looks like getting bigger all the time. Fifth, China's exchange rate policy violates all international norms that are relevant. There's an article of the IMF that commits member countries to, quote, avoid manipulating exchange rates in order to prevent effective balance of payments adjustment or to gain unfair competitive advantage. There's another principle in the IMF that rules out protracted large-scale intervention in one direction in the exchange markets, exactly what China's been doing for 7 years. And there's an article in the World Trade Organization that says, quote, contracting parties shall not by exchange action frustrate the intent of the provisions of this agreement. China is violating all the international norms and rules. Point 6, the competitive undervaluation of the RMB and those neighboring Asian currencies does have, and here I differ with Neil Ferguson, does have a very substantial impact on the United States. We have studied this very carefully at my institute. As I said, we estimate you need a appreciation of 25 to 40% even to bring their global current account surplus down to 3% of their GDP, which would be $150, $200 billion, still pretty strong, pretty high. The impact on the U.S. global current account surplus, global current account deficit, would be to cut our deficit by somewhere between $100 and $150 billion per year. That's a lot of money. It's not our whole deficit, which is now on the order of $500 billion, but it would take something like a quarter to a third off it. If we use the number that the President and the administration have been using, 6,000 jobs per every $1 billion of exports, that correction in our trade imbalance due to Chinese revaluation would save something like, or create, 600,000 to 1.2 million U.S. jobs. I agree with Neil that Paul Krugman's a little high, but I think the numbers would be very substantial. Remember, this is not a full employment economy. The U.S. has 10% unemployment. There's plenty of unutilized capacity. lower dollar in response to a higher RMB would not mean inflation pressure. It would not mean crowding out. It would, in fact, mean more U.S. jobs, mainly high-paying manufacturing jobs. In fact, I would suggest, since the budget cost of this action is zero, revaluation of the Chinese and other Asian currencies are the most cost-effective step that could now be taken to reduce unemployment in the United States. It certainly would be the most important part of the President's National Export Initiative. So, I think the case for a substantial increase in the RMB and the other Asian currencies is clear and overwhelming. I would suggest a three-part strategy to try to achieve it. First, agree with Neil Ferguson, the Treasury should absolutely designate China as a currency manipulator in its report on April 15. The fact that the United States has been unwilling to apply the law of the land and call a spade for at least 5 years has undermined any U.S. effort to get an effective multilateral approach to the problem. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. The basic thrust has to be multilateral. But the U.S. has no credibility seeking that unless it's willing to be honest itself, follow the law of the land, and designate China a manipulator. So that would be step one. But in that same breath, I would take two major new multilateral initiatives. I would go to the IMF and seek agreement, requires a simple majority of the weighted vote, to dispatch the managing director to Beijing on what is called in IMF parlance a special consultation or an ad hoc consultation to seek Chinese agreement to move the currency up. If they don't do it, then you can go to the executive board for a vote. The third step in the process is to go to the World Trade Organization. The United States has the right to seek a dispute settlement panel to look at China's obligations under the WTO that I cited before and ask for it to be declared a violator under the WTO rules. Final point, Mr. Chairman. As you suggest, I've been before this committee many times. I've, in fact, been in this business for over 40 years. In my experience, and here I differ a little bit with the historian, in my experience, no country that's run big trade surpluses and had an undervalued currency has ever been willing to correct itself without external pressure. That pressure may come from the markets, but the Chinese block that through capital controls, or it may come from other governments through political steps. President Nixon and John Connally had to break a lot of crockery back in 1971, you may remember, to get the initial revaluation of the European currencies and the Japanese yen. Jim Baker went to the Plaza Agreement in 1985 on the basis of two bills passed by this House of Representatives that would have caused great pain to our trading partners had they not agreed to correct the currency imbalances of that period. So I'm afraid it's going to take external pressure. The Chinese say, we'll never move in response to external pressure. I would suggest they will never move without external pressure. And if we do it skillfully and multilaterally and thoughtfully, I think we can fashion an effective strategy.